You hearing it good? Okay, cool. That's from years of yelling at students. I do want to start off by mentioning old Ephraim. Just because my dear friend David Rich Lewis, who could not be here tonight, told me that I'd better mention old Ephraim. That folks in Cache Valley are very, very hospitable, but if you try to get away without mentioning old Ephraim, they might just not be happy. So there we go. All right, with that said, I want to turn to the real reason I'm here tonight, and I'm happy to be here tonight to mark the run of H2O Today at the Hiram Museum. It's a fitting last stop for what Megan Van Frank of Utah Humanities, who has managed this whole thing, has lovingly called the Water Circus. She sends out emails to people who are part of the Water Circus. It's been 2 exhibits, 1 global pandemic, a couple of years in the making. A lot of people from Utah Humanities, also Jamie and Courtney here, and staffs at 6 other institutions. The 2 Smithsonian exhibits that are part of Think Water Utah, which included Waterways, and the H2O Today exhibit, which is across the street right now, have visited 7 local host institutions, and their staffs have rolled with the punches, I think, to bring a timely and important program to public audiences. And literally across the entire state, from Kanab within sight of the Arizona border to Hiram, where I guess if you got up on the roof, you might be able to see Idaho, right? And as Courtney mentioned, thinking about water, both historically and our water future, is critical anywhere, but it's particularly relevant today in Utah and in the American West. This is an arid place, and we are currently locked in the midst of what is being called a mega drought. Our skies are choked with the smoke of historic wildfires in California and Oregon, and we're pretty lucky we haven't seen those types of fires here this year. Now, over the past year, what I've been doing is giving a series of talks for Think Water Utah at the various venues, and that focus on local implications for some of the central themes highlighted in the exhibits and the accompanying programs, including the essay that is over there. And if you really want me to sign it, I will. Now, until tonight though, these talks have all been online. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm glad to see people in person. I'm very hopeful for the future. Up to this point, they've all been done on Zoom. Some have been very well attended, but it's not the same. Now, tonight what I want to do though is bring that local context, and I want to use Bear River as a thread to tie together some of the themes that I talk about in the essay. And since I can't possibly speak to all of those themes in the next hour, what I want to focus on are 3 for which I think the Bear River is particularly instructive. I'm going to start out by talking about environmental history and waterways. I use this concept of waterways, and we bring that from that Smithsonian, the original Smithsonian exhibit that toured. And talk about the ways in which any people's waterways are both cultural and natural. It's not just about natural water courses, it's also about the way different peoples engage water. And then I want to move on to how different people's waterways, even in the same places, can be radically different, and how violence and inequity can come from that. And then finally, I want to talk about Bear River as a crucial touchstone for thinking about Utah's water future, and link it to threats to Great Salt Lake, a place that's pretty near and dear to me. So to begin with, let's move on to that first concept, that first theme, that waterways are natural and they're cultural. And so what do I mean by waterways? Well, I'm approaching this as an environmental historian. At the University of Utah, I teach environmental history, one of the subjects that I teach. And environmental historians think about the ways that human cultures have engaged nature throughout their various histories to extract wealth, to make a living. And all human societies, all human cultures engage nature for that reason. They do it in different ways. They create different results, and they have to deal with the consequences of those results. And so when I think about waterways, I think of waterways as natural and cultural. They are made where the natural world intersects with human cultures. Right? So Waterways begins with the central premise that water is life, and that's sort of the tagline for that original exhibit. It's also on the poster over here. No living thing on this planet can exist without water. And this means that the natural world invariably shapes people's waterways. The presence or lack of water might be the most fundamental factor, but water also shapes the landscape. It can facilitate travel or pose obstacles to travel. We'll talk about that in a minute. But waterways are also cultural. That's the point. The ways in which any society engages the natural world reflect that society's culture, its histories, and its values. No two people understand their relationship to nature and to water the same way. Moreover, in a way, the way in which people engage with this life-giving resource might change drastically over time, might change historically. Right? So you have cultural differences, you also have historical differences. I always tell my class that, as historians, our job is to complicate things. They always say, why do you make it so complicated? What's our job? Now, to understand any place's waterways, let's begin with the physical nature of the place. And this means considering when and where we get our water. We live in a dry state. Shouldn't be a surprise to you. Utah is the second driest state. Only Nevada is drier than Utah on average. Aridity is an overriding fact. But depending on where you live in Utah, somewhere between 5 and 15 inches of precipitation generally falls. 50 inches of precipitation in the highest peaks. Right? So season and physiography matter. The physical landscape matters. Right? We get most of our moisture in the winter through winter storms, patterns that come from the Pacific Ocean. Those storms bring moisture across the Great Basin, and when they rise over mountains, they drop that moisture. That's why the west side of our mountain ranges, or any mountain range in the American West, is wetter than the east side. This is the orographic effect, or rain shadow. Right? But that means that our mountains are our reservoirs. You certainly can see it here above the Cache Valley. You can see it in the Salt Lake Valley, where I live. Right? Now, due to its physiography and location, let's get a little bit more local. Oops. Caching, here's a chart. You're not going to sit here and read this entire chart. You'll have to trust me on this one. The key line is right here. Cache Valley is actually one of the wetter places in Utah. Right? 18, 19 inches of precipitation falls in any given year. And while it's spread mostly evenly throughout the year, less falls during the height of summer, the growing season, which means that doing agriculture without irrigation is difficult or impossible. But of course, that only matters, again, culturally, if your society is based on an agrarian model, if that's what you're seeking to do, right? Now, you can see here that, again, throughout the year, rainfall is fairly well distributed here in Utah, in the Cache Valley. Much different than others. I gave a talk out in Vernal, or for the museum in Vernal. The Uinta Basin, much, much drier place in the year, with half the rainfall in a given year. All right. But once this comes down, whoops, got to get my control there. Once this comes down, the question is, where does that water go? And this brings us to the important concept of watersheds. Right? Watersheds are hydrographic or catchment basins. All of the water within a particular watershed ultimately funnels down to a low point, usually a lake or the sea. Where I grew up in Florida, watersheds are pretty hard to discern because it's all really low and flat. Here in Utah, not the same, right? We can tell watersheds because mountain ranges and ridges mark them off, right? Utah is divided into two great natural watersheds. And if you look on this map on the left, right, the two great natural watersheds are the Great Basin, which we're sitting in right now. I know it doesn't seem like the Great Basin, but hydrographically we are. And the Colorado River Basin. Right. Of Utah's two major watersheds, the Colorado system carries far more water, but is more sparsely populated. Still, the phrase far more should be explained. It's not that much water, even in the Colorado or the green. The Colorado system discharges an annual average of 17,000 cubic feet per second. That's over the course of a year. If you compare that to the Mississippi, 35 times as much water. 600,000 cubic feet per second is discharged by the Mississippi on average throughout a year. So the Colorado is still a fairly small river. Now, more constraining, though, than those flows to the east of us in the Colorado River Basin, whoops, oh boy, there we go, is topography, right? It's been the historic inaccessibility of these rivers, these canyons. Along the course of the Green and the Colorado, the rivers often run at the bottom of steep, remote canyons. And it's only in places like the Uinta Basin or Spanish Valley by Moab, where those canyons open up, that populations cluster, where they can cross the river, where they can access that water, right? And so elsewhere in the United States, where rivers have served as critical arteries of transportation, think of the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, the Columbia. Rivers in rivers in Utah mostly pose obstacles to transportation. They're not conduits, right? And I'm a river runner. Even with that, I could say, we can take little tiny rubber rafts down there, but we're not seeing any kind of commercial transport on rivers in the state of Utah. It's more difficult to get across them or get down there. And so, in an arid environment, human life is going to gravitate to where water is available and can be used. And what this means is that in Utah, from the deep past to the present, most people have lived in a narrow oasis along the base of the Wasatch Range, extending down through the Wasatch Plateau. Right? The vast majority of our state populations lives in the Great Basin watershed. The Great Basin encompasses nearly all of Nevada, most of western Utah, parts of Oregon, California, Idaho, and Wyoming. It's actually a collection of many different watersheds, right? They all have one thing in common. They're endorheic, or closed. Their waters never make it to the sea, right? So they end in sinks or playas, places like Great Salt Lake or Sevier Lake, right? The rivers, due to the overriding aridity of the Great Basin and the relatively short length of its rivers, the region streams carry much less water than the Colorado. The Bear River, which is the largest river feeding Great Salt Lake, and it's also the Bear River, you probably know this fact, it's the great trivia question if you ever get asked this. What is the longest river in North America that does not reach the sea? It's the Bear River, right? Longer than the Humboldt. Carries only 2,400 cubic feet per second in an annual discharge. That's less than 1/6 of the flow of the Colorado, which is 35 times smaller than the Mississippi. So we're not talking about a lot of water, but it's not the water that matters as much as the location. Small these streams may be, the Ogden, the Weber, the Provo, the Bear, they feed fertile lands at the foot of the mountains that for thousands of years have supported human populations. And today that narrow strip of land, the so-called Wasatch Oasis zone, stretching from Brigham City to Nephi, is home to more than 80% of Utah's residents. 8 out of 10 Utahns live in that zone. If you add the bigger communities that are growing on the Wasatch back, places like Heber City, Park City, Mountain Green, and so on, it jumps to about 86-87% of our population lives clustered tightly here. And that is really historically the way things have been for 10,000 years. All right, so yet human beings, they may make sense of natural features in different ways. And the Bear River, I think, is particularly valuable in thinking about the intersection of nature and culture and the ways in which it's not just the natural world that defines how people engage with water, right? So let's see if I can do that. There we go. There's a map of the Bear River Basin. The Bear River is, again, the longest river in North America that does not reach the sea. It follows a circuitous path that was defined by millions of years of geological and climatological activity. But while human beings did not set the river's course, the rationalizations of nature have complicated its journey. If you look at this map, let's think about the states and border crossings that are involved. And again, the Bear River is not absolutely unique, but it certainly does a lot of border crossing. It starts in the Uinta Mountains in Utah. It flows north into Wyoming, past Evanston. It jogs west into Utah, then back into Wyoming, then into Idaho, where it arcs around and it comes back into Utah and eventually flows through the Cache Valley and into Great Salt Lake. That's 3 states and 5 border crossings. State boundaries are artificial in many ways, but they also are quite meaningful because what they bring are different laws, different rules for access and possibilities. So even though the natural watercourse of the Bear follows a path that was set by nature and not set by humans, human impositions like state boundaries and state laws do matter. Like the Colorado River, the Bear River flows through multiple states, creating conflicting claims. And like the Colorado, the Bear was subject to an interstate compact to allocate its flows and to regulate storage. This came much later than the 1922 Colorado River Compact. It was first negotiated in the 1950s. The amended Bear River Compact was negotiated in 1978 and then granted congressional approval in 1980. And although there are squabbles over water on the Bear River, there's no doubt about it, those conflicts pale in comparison to the fight over the Colorado that I talked about in a place like Vernal or Green River, especially. We talked about John Wesley Powell. So this circuitous path, I think, illustrates the complex intersection of natural and cultural boundaries that make up waterways, and the important differences between natural watersheds and political boundaries, which define rights and access to this most precious of resources. And that brings us to a second theme for which the Bear River, I think, is also instructive. The gulf between the historic waterways of Utah's native peoples and those of the Mormon pioneers and other Euro-American colonists. Essentially, different cultures with different values and goals will approach the same environment, the same resources, even in the same place, in radically different ways. The central difference between Euro-American and native waterways comes down to adjustment, to adaptation. More precisely, who or what is expected to adapt or change. For the native peoples of Utah, the approach can best be generalized as adaptation. Shoshone people, understanding natural limitations, learned how to maximize the resources that they had and didn't attempt to radically re-engineer their homelands. And here what I'm going to say really applies to many other of the native peoples of Utah, Paiutes, Utes, Goshutes, Navajo people as well. Right? Not to all native peoples, however. Right? So I'm focusing on the Shoshones, but the same general premise is true for Utah's native peoples. For Shoshone peoples, mobility was a crucial strategy for survival throughout much of the year, but it was balanced by the need to stay put at other times. Right? We always think of native peoples, a lot of people think of native peoples being nomadic, but even those who are the most mobile spend much of the year camped in certain places. Each group, Shoshone group, generally possessed a home range centered on winter camps, within which the people had unquestioned right to resources. For the Shoshones of Cache Valley, the ancestors of the northwestern band of the Shoshone Nation, Boa Agoy, the big river, called the Bear River by Euro-Americans, was that center place. Their subsistence cycle, however, invariably took them hundreds of miles each year to access resources that became seasonally available. Depending on where they lived, Shoshone people might fish, they might dig roots, they collect pine nuts, gather grass seeds, go on small or large game hunts, and increasingly after the acquisition of horses, hunt bison. Water was vital to all considerations throughout this subsistence round. Rivers, creeks, springs, and lakes offered fish, waterfowl, aquatic plants, as well as drinking water. Camps were made at or near water sources, and river bottoms were the favored winter camps. They provided shelter along with easy access to water, firewood, and forage for horses. It made perfect sense. Right? These were the places that native peoples would focus on. They're very life-giving. Now this starts to change with the overland migration. As Euro-Americans first traversed and then colonized the land of extremes we call Utah, conflicts emerged that often came down to fights over water. Even before permanent settlement in Utah, immigrants had a profound effect on native resources. At least 1.5 million head of livestock accompanied the immigrants. So this is from a study done by John Unruh many years ago, a classic book called The Plains Across. And what he found is, 1.5 million head of livestock accompany over 250,000 overland immigrants in a 20-year period between 1840 and 1860. Right? Oxen, mules, horses, they're the engine of that immigration. Think about it that way. They're the engine. Grass and water were the fuel. And what that means is that the narrow trail corridors that generally followed water courses or linked springs and other water sources inevitably saw the results of overgrazing, the depletion of game and firewood, and foul water. The Shoshone peoples of the Great Basin, living closest to the trails, felt the greatest immediate impact. But even those who lived farther away from the trails could return to find winter camps that had been despoiled. Right? And in many cases, Euro-Americans would co-opt the most important water sources. This becomes even more critically available the farther we go west across Nevada, where the extreme aridity meant that water was available in not that many places. Now this becomes even more dire for Native peoples with the arrival of the pioneer company of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1847. This is a different matter. Unlike the rest of the overland immigrants, the Mormons intended to stay. The Wasatch Oasis that I described earlier provided their only real opportunity to build a communal agrarian society between the Rocky Mountains and California. And despite church policy aimed at preventing conflict, the relentless expansion of Mormon settlements came at the expense of native lands and native waters, and will lead to conflict. Now, for the members of the faith, religious ideals led to a specific settlement and water use pattern. And we can still see it today. You can see vestige of it right here in Cache Valley. You can really see it down in Sanpete Valley, in a place like Spring City, right? At a time when many Euro-Americans were embracing capitalism and seeking a new life, living on isolated homesteads, Mormons were attempting to recreate the communitarian values they saw in the compact settlements of New England. Rather than families living scattered on isolated homesteads, they would live all together in close proximity, in communities surrounded by farmlands and pastures. In arid Utah, this meant settling in the places that would allow this type of life, that would allow at least a minimum of water to support life, and then working communally to develop those resources. And the result is what scholars call the Mormon cultural landscape. Right? A cultural landscape is a reflection of the physical world, the natural world, but the values of whoever has been using that. Right? And so the Mormon cultural landscape, this is sort of the idealized version. This is an engraving of Salt Lake City in the 1870s. But it includes gridded villages with wide streets, unpainted fences and farm buildings, the Lombardy poplar trees that line the road, right? And most of all, irrigation ditches, big and small, right? That run along the streets, that run out into the fields. There's also additional motivations, though. There are additional political and economic imperatives that church leaders would seek. Brigham Young led the LDS Church West to escape the violence that had followed the church in Missouri and Illinois. His goal was to build a Mormon state of Deseret as far from the Americans as possible. And part of that plan was to create a self-sustaining community with minimal dependence on outsiders or outside imports. And control of water was part of these plans. From the beginning, water was deemed a communal resource. Local bishops and then county commissions, which were then called courts, distributed rights to the faithful on the basis of need and on perceived worthiness. And territorial laws were intended to preserve local control over water. In a sense, keep outsiders at bay. And we can, in the question and answer, we want to get into that, we can talk about that and how some of those laws might have operated. The important point here, though, is as different these values or these goals might be, LDS or Mormon waterways or Euro-American waterways, although the motivations might be different, both Mormon and non-Mormon Euro-Americans approached building waterways in Utah very differently from native peoples. For them, it was not a matter of adapting to nature, but a matter of changing nature, trying to bend it to suit their desired outcome. Right? And that is what we see along the Wasatch Front and throughout the American West, and increasingly in the 20th and 21st centuries, it becomes increasingly technological, large-scale plumbing projects, right, to move water. One of those I discussed when I did the talk for the museum in Vernal, talked about the Central Utah Project, which is essentially, a massive interbasin transfer to move water from that Colorado River basin across the divide to where everyone lives along the Wasatch Front. But we'll get to another possible project in conclusion tonight. Now, while Mormon expansion was first focused on the Tooele Valley and the Utah Valley homelands and the Timpanogos Utes, in each case, violence was the result. And as most folks here know, by 1858, Mormon settlement came to the Cache Valley. And in January of 1863, Boa Agoy, the life-giving place central to the Shoshone people, became a place of death. And that story is very well known, I think, to a lot of people in this room. And rather than retelling it, I'm sitting here looking at Darren Perry back there in the back, who will probably be can tell that story much better than me and tell it from a Shoshone perspective. What I simply want to do is underscore how native waterways, the waterways that sustained people for generations, also made them vulnerable to Connor's forces. Right? The way in which they engage with water and nature also made them vulnerable. Right? Connor knew where to find the Shoshones. He knew from settlers' reports, but he also knew that they were encamped on a creek flowing into Boa Agoy. That due to nearby hot springs was a favored winter camp. Indeed, many more Shoshones had recently gathered there to celebrate a warm dance to welcome the coming of spring. Winter camps were essential for survival. They meant people stayed in one place for an extended period of time. But what they also meant was that people were easy to find and easy to strike. And such attacks became standard tactics for the United States military over the next decade. Right? So Bear River, Boa Agoy is not the only one, right? It may be the first during the Civil War, but it's followed by Sand Creek. And then in the 1870s, the Marias Massacre, the Baker Massacre in northern Montana, Battle of Palo Duro Canyon in the Texas Panhandle. In every single case, the U.S. Army knew where to strike Native peoples in sedentary winter camps and to destroy their resources and to destroy their ability, essentially, to survive and to live outside of the reservation system. So this is going to facilitate removal of Native peoples from their homelands. Now, of course, the Shoshone story, I had this slide I should have advanced here. And whenever I show this slide, I have to thank Ken Cannon, who loaned it to me. It's the best slide I know for actually visualizing the massacre site. And if you've ever been up there, but of course, the Shoshone story does not end with the massacre. Chief Sagwitch survived, as did others who continued to look to his leadership. Until her passing in 2007, Mae Timbimbu Perry, Sagwitch's granddaughter, was the keeper of her people's stories, including those of the massacre. As an elder and teacher, she ensured that future generations would remember. And in 2018, the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation, then led by Chairman Darren Perry, Mae's grandson and Sagwitch's great-great-great-grandson, hope I got that sequence right, completed the purchase of the massacre site. And today, the tribe is in the process of building a memorial interpretive center at the site. The plans call, I think, very fittingly for replanting native willows and other vegetation and restoring a critical measure of indigenous life to that place. All right. So finally, my third and final topic that I wanted to discuss. I want to return to the Bear River as a way to think about our uncertain water future and consider the lessons that Bear River, the Great Salt Lake might provide or might help us in terms of making decisions about the future. Now, in the Waterways essay, I refer to the Great Salt Lake as our canary in a coal mine. And what I mean by that is the Great Salt Lake is where the consequences of our water use decisions will be seen most rapidly and can be seen most clearly. And we cannot understand the future of Great Salt Lake without also considering the importance of Bear River, its largest tributary. About 60% of the fresh water that flows into Great Salt Lake in any given year comes from the Bear River alone. 60%, over half. Right? Far less from the Jordan, far less from the Weber or Ogden system, about 20% each there. Now today, Utah faces two great challenges for its water future. Right? One is population growth, the other is climate change. This dynamic is not unique to Utah. It's actually, as you could see it throughout the American West, I would argue, in so many places. But it is perhaps most extreme in the state of Utah, the intersection of population growth and climate change. In terms of percentage population growth, Utah is the fastest growing state in the nation. I say that with authority because 2 weeks ago, the United States Census Bureau released that data. According to the 2020 census, the state of Utah's population grew by 18.4% over the last 10 years. Right? That's faster than any other state in the nation, and that is 2.5 times, over 2.5 times the national average. The first census conducted in Utah in 1850 found 11,000 non-indigenous people. 11,000 in 1850. Half a century later, in 1900, the first census conducted in the new state of Utah found that the state was home to over 250,000 people. From 11,000 to 250,000. It takes until 1950 for the state to cross the threshold of 1 million residents. Excuse me, it takes until 1970 for the state to cross it. Wrap your head around that. It's only 50 years ago that the state of Utah had only 1 million residents. In the past 50 years, the population has more than tripled. The estimated population of Utah today is 3.3 million people. Right? Where are they concentrated? Well, they're concentrated in the same places with one major exception, right? Mostly it's along the Wasatch Oasis, the Wasatch Front, and the areas like I mentioned that have grown around the Wasatch Back, places like Park City and Heber City and Midway and so on, right? The other place that's growing crazily out of control, and I'm sure the people in Washington County don't want to hear that, is Washington County. You know, Washington County has, I'm not even going to those growth rates down there, but those are amenity communities, right? And the growth of all of these places is predicated on more water. Now, at the same time, Utah is also one of the fastest warming places on the planet, right? This is data that covers the last century, right? Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, greenhouse gases, with CO2 being chief among them, have trapped an increasing amount of the sun's radiant energy in our atmosphere. Melting polar ice caps and rising sea levels are already evident. But in Utah, there's evidence much closer to home. Many areas in Utah have warmed by more than between 2 and 3 degrees in the last century, with the change most pronounced, as you can see here, in places like southeastern Utah, around Moab, and around Grand Junction in western Colorado, an average 3-degree increase, which is beyond what scientists say we can have. So we are a fast-growing, fast-warming place. And our water use doesn't help. Utah, year to year, per capita domestic water use in Utah is at the very top end of the scale. Utah only trails our neighbors in Idaho and Nevada. And while there have been improvements in conservation and efficiency, a 2016 paper produced by Utah State University found that overall water use has increased by 5% because of relentless population growth. Right? If you're bringing in more and more people, conservation measures can't stop the increase in demand. Now, where does all this water get used? Well, over 80% of Utah's water is used in agriculture still today, right? The remaining amount is used in what is called municipal M&I, municipal and industrial uses. In municipal use, about 10% is household. So only about 10% of Utah's water gets used in the household. How much do you think gets used inside the house? 4%. So 60%, right, of the household water that's used is put on lawns, right? So only on average about 4% of the actual water used per capita domestically in Utah cities is used to cook, to clean, to flush toilets, take a shower. Now what this all means is that these numbers are not really good, especially for a place like Great Salt Lake. The major reason that Great Salt Lake is vulnerable is that it possesses no guaranteed water right. In 2016, and you can see the lake levels there, they're much lower today, was precariously close to the then historic low measured in 1963. That study I mentioned, conducted by Utah State University, concluded that diversions of the lake's principal water sources, principally the Bear, the Weber, and the Jordan, were largely responsible for reducing its volume by about half and dropping its surface elevation an estimated 11 feet. Right? This exposes mudflats that quickly turn into dusty playas. The study concluded that without any consumptive water use, which is not a realistic thing, they're running numbers, they're running models. It's not a realistic thing to say there would be no consumptive water use. But if there had been none since 1847, the lake level they projected would have stayed relatively stable at about 4,207 feet above sea level. Now this decline has gotten worse over the past 5 years as the drought and population growth have only exacerbated the problem. Again, Great Salt Lake has no in-stream flow claim. There's no legal right for the lake to get water. Right? The Bear water could theoretically be completely dewatered by water users. Same with the Ogden, same with the Jordan, and so on. Right? On July 23rd of this year, the day before Pioneer Day, the surface level of Great Salt Lake dropped below the lowest level ever recorded in history. And that was 4,191 feet. It has since set almost daily records. Today I went online at 8:15 this morning, 8:15, September 8th, 2021. The lake surface was at 4,190 feet, right? That's 10 feet below the management benchmark of average 4,200 feet that was set by the Utah State Legislature in the 1980s. And at that average level, the surface of Great Salt, at average level of 4,200 feet, the Great Salt Lake covers some 1,700 square miles. And today the lake covers less than 950 square miles, right? Vast areas of lake bed are exposed. One of the more frightening pictures, this is from NASA. And so this is the south arm, the railroad causeway, the north arm of the lake. So the north is at that end, right? Essentially dewatered by 2017 in many cases. Gunnison Island, home to the Pelican Rookery, is an exposed landmass now. Predators can just walk right out to the island that had been this secure place, right? This is not to say that unusually wet periods will not come again, right? There absolutely will. There will be wet years that come. Natural cycles of drought and rain do occur. The lake will rise temporarily, but as long as Great Salt Lake has no guaranteed inflow, as urban development and water diversions increase, our warming climate threatens to reduce water supplies statewide, and the long-term forecast for Great Salt Lake is downward. Now, what might future look like for Great Salt Lake if we do nothing? Well, we know we have some models, because Great Salt Lake is not the only threatened saline lake on the planet. There are many others at risk. The best known, of course, is the Aral Sea. Once it was the 4th largest lake on Earth. It was roughly 10 times the size of Great Salt Lake. Beginning in 1960, however, massive diversions of its river, the rivers that fed the Aral Sea, went to water some 5 million acres of cotton and other crops. It was a massive Soviet-era irrigation project in Soviet Central Asia. Right? With no guaranteed inflow, the lake's water levels began to drop. By the late 1990s, nearly 90% of the Aral Sea was dry. It was a desolate playa, where once there were fisheries, sturgeon fisheries and roe and so on. And you can see the size of the boats that once plied the Aral Sea. Right? Instead, now the productive fishery was gone, and wind stirred up a toxic mix of dust, pollutants, and pollutants that fouled the region's air. Now, could Great Salt Lake become another Aral Sea? Maybe. Recent studies suggest that Utah is already moving in that direction, but that it's also not too late. Researchers at Brigham Young University have found that 90% of the dust in the air along the Wasatch Front originates in the dry lake beds of Utah's West Desert. And when I say that, I don't mean what's in the air right now, because we know it's California and Oregon are in the air right now. Right? There's a forest fire smoke that's out there. But the dust storms that have plagued, I don't know if you get them here in the Cache Valley, but we will get bad dust storms in Salt Lake City. You wake up in your front door and your windows are all coated in dust. Right? 90% of this is coming from the West Desert. Another study conducted by Atmospheric Science at the University of Utah identified 4 dust plume hotspots around Great Salt Lake that include the now dry Farmington Bay, which lies between Antelope Island and suburban Davis County. That last map. That's Farmington Bay, just to the east of Antelope Island. Right? These dust plume hotspots. The study concluded if lake level was maintained at average, at what the legislature deemed average, 4,200 feet, 75% of the problem areas of these dust hotspots would remain submerged. Right? And there's a lot that potentially could be lost with a lost Great Salt Lake. A 2019 study commissioned by the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, which is a state board, found that the monetized impact of a drying lake could lead to a yearly loss between $1.7 and $2.2 billion to the Utah economy and up to 6,500 jobs. The decline would mostly be felt in the mineral industry, but lowering lake levels would also impact recreation, including Utah's greatest snow on Earth. Without Great Salt Lake, the Wasatch snowpack could see an annual decline between 5 and 8%. You've all heard of lake effect snow, right? It's part of the orographic effect. In fact, this dry air moves across the Great Basin, crosses this shallow pond we call the Great Salt Lake, and then rises over those mountains. That contributes to Utah's famous powder snow. Right? There's many other costs, from the cost of birds and other wildlife, the loss of historical and cultural and aesthetic values, which could be as hard to monetize, but they are just as important. And this is where we get back to Bear River. As most of you probably know and are well aware, the Bear River is a focus point of Utah's largest proposed water development projects. One that is slated to divert more water from the river to sustain urban growth along the Wasatch Oasis zone. It's been 30 years already since the Utah State Legislature passed the Bear River Development Act. It's 1991. And that directed the Division of Water Resources to develop water resources to benefit the residents of northern Utah. The original plan was to have project water delivered by 2015, but today the projected date has been pushed back to 2045 or later. Conservation and efficiency measures are partially responsible for this delay, and that's a good thing, no doubt about it. Yet the development, again, is meant to benefit the growing urban centers, mostly along the Wasatch Front. There are 4 member districts in the Act: the Cache, Bear River, which is Brigham City, the Weber Basin, the Ogden area, and finally the Jordan Valley. Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District makes up most of the Salt Lake Valley. Pretty much all the municipalities in the Salt Lake Valley besides Salt Lake City proper. They are slated to split up to 220,000 acre feet of water per year. Right, 60,000 acre feet per year to Cache and Bear River districts, 50K to the others. Right. Now, a 2019 feasibility study found that not all of the water diverted, that map up there, that not all the water diverted from Bear River would be depleted from the watershed, and estimated that more than half of that water would come back into the watershed through return flows. Yet even with this optimistic assessment, the same study predicts that the level of Great Salt Lake would fall by an additional 8.5 to 14 inches. So perhaps another foot below the historic low that it is at now. And so the math is not good for Great Salt Lake, and it's not good for Utah's air quality. And that's why I talk about Great Salt Lake kind of as this canary in a coal mine, something that hopefully gets us to stop and think. There are no easy answers. I'm not up here going to tell you, I'm not up here to pound the lectern and say cancel the Bear River Development Project. I'm here though, hopefully, to get you to think about it. We cannot stop growth entirely, but we can manage it more effectively. We must prioritize, in my opinion, conservation and efficiency measures over developing greater supplies. Greater supplies always have the effect of encouraging even more growth, which creates even greater demand. It is this inescapable cycle. We saw it in Los Angeles in the early 20th century. It is the same kind of logic behind the Lake Powell pipeline, which right now is really, I think, sort of on the shelf with the lowering levels of the Colorado and the emergency declared for the Colorado River during this mega drought. But ultimately, these are not easy decisions. They will not happen overnight. And my hope is that projects like Think Water Utah encourage open and meaningful discussion of our future and will hopefully inform public decision making. And that's where I wanted to conclude tonight. I wanted to, again, bring Bear River central to Utah Waterways and set the stage for you to think about some of the themes that you'll see hopefully when you cross the street and tour the exhibit in a few minutes. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.